The gunshots shattered the silence of the affluent Balboa Coves neighborhood at exactly 9:09 p.m. 6 bullets. 6 perfectly placed rounds that tore through the darkness and found their mark in the body of William Francis McLaughlin as he stood in his own kitchen, a glass of milk still clutched in his hand. The 65-year-old millionaire never had a chance. He never saw his killer's face. He never heard them enter. One moment he was reaching for the refrigerator door, planning his evening, thinking about the business deals waiting for him tomorrow. The next moment, he was dying on the imported Italian tile floor of his $1 million home, blood pooling around him in the golden glow of his kitchen lights. In the master bedroom upstairs, his girlfriend Annette Packard Johnston heard the shots. She would later tell police she thought it was the television. She waited. She called out Bill's name. No answer. She descended the stairs slowly, her silk nightgown whispering against her legs, her heart beginning to race. She found him there, crumpled and broken, his life draining away beneath the track lighting he'd had installed just 3 months earlier. But this story doesn't begin with William McLaughlin's murder. And it doesn't end there either. This is a story about greed, about passion, about a woman who wanted everything and 2 men who paid the ultimate price, one with his life and one with his freedom. This is a story of Eric Naposki, a man whose powerful hands had once carried footballs across NFL end zones, and who would later be accused of pulling a trigger 6 times in cold blood. The question that would haunt investigators for 16 years was simple. Did he do it? And if so, why did it take so long to bring him to justice? Please subscribe to True Crime Zone, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now let's continue. To understand how a professional athlete ended up at the center of one of Orange County's most sensational murder cases, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand who Eric Naposki was before everything went wrong. Eric Naposki was born on December 20th, 1966, in New York City. From an early age, he was bigger than the other kids, stronger, more physical. By the time he reached high school, he'd grown into his frame, standing 6 feet tall and weighing over 200 pounds of solid muscle. Football wasn't just a sport for Eric. It was his identity. It was the thing that made him special, the thing that set him apart from everyone else. He played linebacker at Valley Stream Central High School on Long Island, where he became known for his punishing tackles and his relentless pursuit of the ball. Coaches loved him. Scouts noticed him. By his senior year, college recruiters were showing up to watch him play, taking notes, making promises. Eric had the kind of raw talent that couldn't be taught. He had instinct. He had aggression. He had the ability to read a play before it developed and position himself exactly where he needed to be to make the hit. In 1985, Eric accepted a football scholarship to the University of Connecticut. For a kid from New York who'd grown up without much, this was everything. This was his ticket. He spent 4 years playing for the Yukon Huskies, refining his technique, building his body, preparing for the dream that every college football player shares, making it to the NFL. And in 1988, that dream came true. The New England Patriots selected Eric Naposki in the 12th round of the NFL draft. It wasn't a glamorous pick. 12th round selections rarely make the team, but Eric didn't care. He'd made it. He was going to play professional football. He reported to training camp that summer with everything to prove, knowing that every snap, every tackle, every moment on the field might be his last chance to impress the coaches. Eric made the team. He appeared in 3 games for the Patriots during the 1988 season, playing special teams and backup linebacker. It wasn't a starring role, but he was on an NFL roster, collecting an NFL paycheck, living the dream. The following year, he signed with the Indianapolis Colts, where he spent the 1989 season bouncing between the active roster and the practice squad. But professional football is a brutal business. Careers are short, injuries are frequent, and there are always younger, faster, cheaper players waiting to take your spot. By 1991, Eric's NFL career was over. He was 24 years old, and the thing that had defined his entire life was suddenly gone. This is where Eric Naposki's story could have ended. Another cautionary tale about an athlete who couldn't make the transition from sports to civilian life. But Eric wasn't ready to give up. He moved to California, settling in Orange County, and began working as a personal trainer and security consultant. He stayed in shape, kept his body NFL ready, and started looking for opportunities in a world that suddenly felt very different from the one he'd known. It was in this in-between space, in this period of transition and uncertainty, that Eric Naposki's life took a fateful turn. Because in 1994, he walked into a gym in Newport Beach and met a woman who would change everything. Her name was Nanette Packard Johnston, and she was about to make Eric Naposki an offer he couldn't refuse. If Eric Naposki was a muscle in this story, Nanette Johnston was a brain. And what a brain it was. Calculating, manipulative, and always working 3 steps ahead of everyone around her. Nanette Packard was born on May 18, 1956, in Ohio. By all accounts, she was an attractive woman, blonde, well-dressed, with a smile that could disarm suspicion, and a voice that dripped with honey when she needed something. But beneath the surface charm lay something much colder. A woman driven by an insatiable appetite for money, status, and control. Nanette had been married before. She had children from previous relationships. But by the early 1990s, she was single and working at a financial consulting firm in Orange County, where she specialized in helping wealthy clients manage their investments. This was perfect for Nanette because it gave her access to exactly the kind of men she was looking for: rich, often older, and sometimes vulnerable. In 1991, she met William Francis McLaughlin. Bill McLaughlin was everything Nanette wanted. At 55 years old, he was a self-made millionaire who'd built his fortune in the medical technology industry. He'd co-founded a company called AMCCO, which manufactured medical equipment. And when he sold his stake in the company, he walked away with millions. He lived in a magnificent home in Balboa Coves, one of Newport Beach's most exclusive neighborhoods. He drove expensive cars. He belonged to country clubs. He had season tickets to Chargers games. He was also recently divorced, lonely, and susceptible to the charms of an attractive woman who seemed genuinely interested in him. Nanette moved quickly. Within months of meeting Bill, she'd become his girlfriend. Within a year, she'd moved into his home, bringing her 2 children with her. Bill seemed happy. His friends and family noticed a change in him. He smiled more, seemed more relaxed, talked about possibly getting married again. But there were things about Nanette that Bill didn't know. Things she was very careful to keep hidden. For one, Nanette had expensive taste that far exceeded her income. She liked designer clothes, jewelry, luxury vacations. She'd run up significant debts before meeting Bill, and she was always looking for ways to access more money. Bill was generous with her, giving her a credit card on his account, paying for her expenses, even helping to support her children. But it was never enough. Nanette always wanted more. For another, Nanette was not the faithful, devoted partner she pretended to be. She liked men, lots of them. She liked the attention, the validation, the power that came from manipulating multiple relationships at once. And in 1994, while she was living with Bill McLaughlin and enjoying his money, she met a man at her gym who caught her eye. He was big, muscular, handsome. He was a former NFL player. His name was Eric Naposki. And Nanette Johnston saw an opportunity. To understand the tragedy of what happened to William McLaughlin, you need to understand what kind of man he was. Because Bill McLaughlin wasn't just a rich guy who got killed. He was a father, a businessman, a man who'd worked hard for everything he had. Bill was born in 1929, which meant he'd lived through the Depression, World War II, and the complete transformation of American society over 65 years. He'd served in the military. He'd put himself through school. He'd started businesses that failed before he finally found success with AMCCO. He knew what it meant to struggle, to work 18-hour days, to put everything on the line for a dream that might not pan out. When his first marriage ended in divorce, it devastated him. He'd been married for decades, raised children, built a life. The divorce was painful, expensive, and emotionally draining. Friends said he aged 10 years in the span of 12 months. He threw himself into his work, into building his wealth. But there was a loneliness there that money couldn't fill. That's what made him vulnerable to Nanette. She came into his life when he was ready to believe in love again, ready to open his heart to someone new, and he fell for her completely. Bill was generous almost to a fault. When Nanette moved in, he welcomed her children into his home. He paid for their expenses, treated them like family. He gave Nanette access to his credit cards and bank accounts because he trusted her. He talked to friends about changing his will to include her, about making sure she'd be taken care of if anything happened to him. His children from his first marriage had concerns. They liked Nanette well enough at first, but as time went on, they noticed things. She spent money extravagantly. She was secretive about her activities. She seemed more interested in their father's wealth than in their father. They tried to voice their concerns, but Bill brushed them off. He was in love. He was happy. He didn't want to hear anything negative about the woman who brought joy back into his life. By late 1994, Bill had been with Nanette for nearly 3 years. There were problems in the relationship. There always are, but he was committed to making it work. He was 65 years old. He'd built a fortune worth over $55 million. He had his health, his home, his business interests. He had grandchildren he adored and friends he'd known for decades. He had, by any measure, a good life, a life worth living. He had no idea that life was about to be taken from him, violently and suddenly, by someone he'd never met, for reasons that had nothing to do with him at all. The exact details of when and where Eric Naposki and Nanette Johnston first met are lost to time and conflicting testimony, but most accounts place their first encounter at a gym in Newport Beach in early 1994. Eric was working as a personal trainer, and Nanette was a member who came in regularly to work out. It's not hard to imagine how it started. Nanette was attractive, charming, and looking for exactly someone like Eric. Eric was struggling financially, trying to figure out his life after football, and susceptible to the attention of an older, sophisticated woman who seemed fascinated by him. They started talking. The conversations got longer, more personal. Nanette told Eric about her life, carefully editing the parts she didn't want him to know. She didn't mention Bill McLaughlin, at least not at first. She presented herself as an independent woman, financially secure, available. Eric was interested. More than interested, he was captivated. Here was a woman who seemed to have her life together, who appreciated him for more than just his athletic abilities, who made him feel important in a way he hadn't felt since his football career ended. They started dating. And that's when Nanette's careful manipulation began. By the summer of 1994, Nanette Johnston was living an extraordinarily complicated double life. During the day and most evenings, she was Bill McLaughlin's devoted girlfriend, living in his home in Balboa Coves, eating dinner with him, sleeping in his bed, accompanying him to social events. She played the role perfectly, attentive, loving, domestic. But several nights a week, she would tell Bill she was going out with friends or had business to attend to. And then she would drive to Eric Naposki's apartment in Tustin, where she would spend hours with him, maintaining a completely different persona. To Eric, she was his girlfriend. She told him she was single, that she lived alone, that she was falling in love with him. Eric had no idea about Bill McLaughlin. Nanette never mentioned him, never let slip that she was living with a millionaire in Newport Beach. She was careful, meticulous, always covering her tracks. This deception required incredible energy and planning. Nanette had to remember which lies she told to which person. She had to coordinate her schedules carefully, making sure Eric and Bill never crossed paths, never had reason to suspect her double life. She had to maintain separate phone numbers, separate stories, separate versions of herself. But Nanette was good at lying. She'd been doing it her whole life. As the affair intensified, Eric fell deeper in love. He talked to friends about Nanette, about how she was different from other women he'd dated, about how he thought she might be the one. He introduced her to his family. He started imagining a future with her. Meanwhile, Bill McLaughlin remained blissfully unaware that his girlfriend was conducting an affair with a former NFL linebacker half his age. This arrangement could have continued indefinitely. Nanette could have kept both men on the hook, enjoying Bill's money and Eric's attention, playing one against the other. But there was a problem, and it was a big one. Nanette needed more money, a lot more money, and Bill McLaughlin was starting to get suspicious. By late 1994, Nanette's financial situation was becoming desperate. Despite having access to Bill's credit cards and living rent-free in his home, She managed to accumulate significant debts. She was spending money faster than she could access it, buying designer clothes, jewelry, taking trips. Her lifestyle exceeded even Bill's considerable generosity. Worse, she'd been embezzling money from Bill. She'd forged his signature on checks, transferred money from his accounts into her own, used his credit cards for unauthorized purchases. The amounts were significant, hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of their relationship. Bill was starting to notice. His accountant had flagged some irregularities. Bills were higher than expected. There were charges he didn't recognize. When he asked Nanette about them, she had explanations ready. She bought gifts for her children. She had unexpected expenses. There must be some mistake with the accounting. But Bill was a businessman. He hadn't built a $55 million fortune by being careless with money. He started paying closer attention to his accounts. He started asking more questions. In November 1994, Bill told Nanette he was going to have a complete audit done of his finances. He wanted to understand exactly where his money was going. He wanted a full accounting of every charge, every check, every transfer. Nanette knew what that meant. An audit would expose everything. The embezzlement, the forgeries, the theft. She'd be caught. Bill would leave her. Worse, he might press charges. She could go to prison. She needed a solution. And in her mind, there was only one option that would solve all her problems at once. Bill McLaughlin had to die. Here's where Nanette's plan gets truly diabolical. Because killing Bill McLaughlin wasn't just about avoiding exposure for her theft. It was about securing her financial future permanently. In 1993, Nanette had convinced Bill to purchase life insurance policies with her as the beneficiary. The total value of these policies was $1 million, a substantial sum, but not unusual for a wealthy man wanting to provide for his girlfriend. Bill had signed the paperwork without much thought. It seemed like a reasonable thing to do. What Bill didn't know was that Nanette had forged his signature on additional life insurance applications. By the end of 1994, there were policies on Bill's life totaling approximately $2.5 million, all listing Nanette as the primary beneficiary. If Bill died, Nanette would receive millions, more than enough to pay off her debts, maintain her lifestyle, and start over. All she needed was for Bill to die before he discovered her theft and before he changed his will or his insurance policies. There was just one problem. Nanette couldn't kill Bill herself. The girlfriend is always the first suspect. She needed someone else to pull the trigger, someone who could be trusted, someone who would do it for the right reasons, or the right lies. She needed Eric Naposki. Throughout November and December of 1994, Nanette carefully laid the groundwork for murder. She began telling Eric stories about Bill McLaughlin, except she never called him Bill, and she never told Eric he was her boyfriend. Instead, she presented Bill as her business partner, someone she'd been in a complicated financial arrangement with for several years. According to Nanette's carefully constructed lies, Bill was abusive. He was threatening her. He was trying to cheat her out of money she was owed. She was afraid of him. She didn't know what to do. Eric, who fancied himself protector, was outraged on Nanette's behalf. He offered to help. He'd talk to this guy, straighten him out, make sure he left Nanette alone. But Nanette told him it was more complicated than that. Bill was dangerous. He had connections. Talking to him wouldn't work. She needed something more permanent. The conversations were always vague, always deniable. Nanette never explicitly said, "I want you to kill him." She was too smart for that. Instead, she painted a picture of herself as a victim, of Bill as a monster, and let Eric's imagination fill in the blanks. She also began setting up her alibi. She made sure people knew she was going to be at a dinner party on December 15th. She talked about it for weeks in advance, made sure everyone remembered she'd be there. She was creating distance between herself and whatever was going to happen that night. And she gave Eric a key to Bill McLaughlin's house. She told him she needed him to retrieve some business documents from the house on the evening of December 15th. Bill would be home alone. Eric should go in, get the papers from the office, and leave. Simple, except it wasn't about papers. It was never about papers. Nanette was sending Eric Naposki to kill Bill McLaughlin. And Eric, whether he fully understood what he was doing or whether he convinced himself he was just protecting Nanette, was going to do it. The day started normally enough. Bill McLaughlin went about his usual routine. Business calls, meetings, lunch with friends. Nanette was home with him for part of the day, acting as she always did, giving no indication that this would be the last day of Bill's life. In the afternoon, Nanette left the house. She told Bill she was going to a dinner party at her friend's house. She'd be back late. Bill said that was fine. He'd spend a quiet evening at home, maybe watch some television, catch up on some reading. Nanette drove to Eric's apartment. She needed to make sure he understood what to do, needed to make sure he was going through with it. The conversations they had that afternoon would later become the subject of intense speculation. What exactly did Nanette tell Eric? Did she explicitly order him to kill Bill? Or did she manipulate him into believing he was doing something necessary, something justified? Whatever was said, Eric prepared for his mission. He dressed in dark clothing. He checked the gun, a 9mm Beretta that Nanette had access to through Bill's collection. Bill owned several firearms, kept them in the house for protection. Nanette had made sure one of them found its way to Eric. At approximately 8:30 p.m., Nanette arrived at her friend's dinner party. She made sure everyone saw her, made sure people would remember she was there. She was building her alibi, creating distance between herself and the murder. At approximately 9 p.m., Eric Naposki pulled into the Balboa Coves neighborhood. He parked his white Ford Bronco on the street, not in the driveway. He didn't want to be blocked in, wanted to be able to leave quickly. He walked to the front door of 11 Balboa Coves. He used Nanette's key to let himself in. The house was quiet. Upstairs, Bill McLaughlin was in the master bedroom, watching television or reading. He didn't hear Eric enter. Eric moved through the house, his heart pounding. Whatever he thought he was doing, protecting Nanette, confronting an abusive man, retrieving documents. The moment was here. He couldn't turn back now. At 9:09 p.m., Bill McLaughlin came downstairs. He was thirsty. He wanted a glass of milk before bed. He walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and reached inside. He never saw Eric Naposki step out of the shadows. The first shot hit Bill in the back. He spun around, shocked, confused, his mind unable to process what was happening. The second shot hit him in the chest. He fell backward, his glass of milk shattering on the tile floor. Eric kept shooting. 3 more shots, maybe 4, the reports deafening in the enclosed space of the kitchen. Bill McLaughlin collapsed, his body jerking with each impact, blood spreading across the floor. And then it was over. 6 shots in total. Bill McLaughlin, 65 years old, millionaire, father, grandfather, lay dying on his kitchen floor. Eric fled. He ran to his Bronco, started the engine, and drove away from Balboa Coves, his hands shaking on the steering wheel, the gun still hot from being fired. At the dinner party, Nanette checked her watch. It was 9:15 p.m. She smiled at her friends and poured herself another glass of wine. The Newport Beach Police Department received a 911 call at 9:13 p.m. A woman hysterical, screaming that her boyfriend had been shot. Officers were dispatched immediately. They arrived at 11 Balboa Coves within minutes. What they found was a nightmare. Bill McLaughlin was on the kitchen floor, barely alive, struggling to breathe. There was blood everywhere, on the tile, on the cabinets, pooled around his body. 6 shell casings were scattered across the floor. The glass from the shattered milk bottle glittered in the light. Paramedics worked frantically to save him, but the damage was too severe. Bill had been shot 6 times, including shots to major organs. He was losing blood faster than they could replace it. They loaded him into the ambulance and rushed him to Hoag Hospital, but it was too late. Bill McLaughlin was pronounced dead at 10:45 p.m. on December 15th, 1994. Back at the house, detectives were processing the scene. This was clearly a homicide. 6 gunshots at close range didn't happen accidentally. But what was the motive? Who would want Bill McLaughlin dead? The house hadn't been ransacked. Bill's wallet was still in his pocket, his expensive watch still on his wrist. This wasn't a robbery. The killer had come with a specific purpose: to murder Bill McLaughlin. Upstairs, They found Nanette Johnston. She was crying, shaking, claiming she'd been upstairs when she heard the shots. She'd come downstairs and found Bill dying. She called 911 immediately. She had no idea who could have done this. The detectives had questions. Who else had access to the house? Did Bill have any enemies? Had there been any threats? Were there any recent conflicts? Nanette was helpful, almost too helpful. She told him about Bill's business dealings, about how he'd made a lot of money in medical devices. She suggested that maybe it was a business dispute, someone he'd crossed in a deal. She mentioned that Bill kept guns in the house. Maybe someone had stolen one and used it against him? The detectives took notes. They were polite, sympathetic, but they were also suspicious. In any homicide investigation, the first people you look at are those closest to the victim: spouses, partners, family members, people with access and opportunity. And Nanette Johnston had both. Within 48 hours of the murder, the investigation focused intensely on Nanette. Detectives discovered several troubling facts. First, she was a beneficiary of substantial life insurance policies on Bill's life, approximately $2.5 million in total. That was a powerful motive for murder. Second, there were serious questions about her alibi. She claimed she was upstairs when Bill was shot, but the medical examiner's report suggested Bill had died almost instantly. If Nanette had really been upstairs, why did it take her 4 minutes to call 911? What was she doing during those 4 minutes? Third, Bill's children revealed that their father had been planning to have his finances audited. They told detectives that Nanette had been spending Bill's money recklessly, and that Bill had recently become suspicious of some irregularities in his accounts. Fourth, and perhaps most damning, detectives discovered that one of Bill's guns was missing, a 9mm Beretta. The shell casings found at the scene were from a 9mm weapon. The ballistics were consistent. The murder weapon had likely come from Bill's own collection. Who had access to Bill's guns? Nanette did. Detectives brought Nanette in for questioning multiple times. They pressed her about her finances, about the life insurance policies, about her whereabouts that evening. But Nanette was calm, collected, and consistent. Yes, she was the beneficiary of Bill's life insurance, but that was because they were in a committed relationship. Yes, she'd been spending money, but Bill had given her permission. Yes, she was upstairs when Bill was shot, and she called 911 as soon as she found him. She had answers for everything. And without physical evidence directly linking her to the murder, without a witness who could place her at the scene, the detectives couldn't arrest her, but they kept investigating. They were certain Nanette was involved. They just needed to figure out how. The break came from the neighbors. Several residents of Balboa Coves reported seeing an unfamiliar vehicle in the neighborhood on the night of the murder, a white Ford Bronco. One neighbor remembered it particularly well because the driver had seemed to be waiting for something, sitting in the vehicle for several minutes before getting out and walking toward Bill's house. The neighbor tried to describe the driver: large build, muscular, white male, dark clothing. This was significant. If someone had been at Bill's house that night, someone Nanette knew, it would suggest she was involved in a murder-for-hire scheme. Detectives began investigating Nanette's associates, her friends, her social circle. They checked phone records, bank accounts, anything that might connect her to a potential hitman. And then they got lucky. Another neighbor mentioned seeing a white Ford Bronco parked outside Nanette's house on previous occasions. It wasn't Bill's vehicle. It belonged to someone else, someone who visited Nanette regularly. The detectives pulled more phone records. They discovered numerous calls between Nanette's phone and a number registered to a man named Eric Naposki. The calls were frequent, multiple times per day, often late at night. These weren't the phone patterns of casual acquaintances. These were the phone patterns of people in an intimate relationship. The detectives ran a background check on Eric Naposki, former NFL linebacker, living in Tustin, driving a white Ford Bronco. This was their man. This was the piece that connected everything together. Nanette hadn't killed Bill herself. She'd used Eric Naposki to do it. The problem facing the Newport Beach Police Department was evidence, or rather, the lack of it. They had a theory. Nanette Johnston had manipulated Eric Naposki into murdering Bill McLaughlin so she could collect the life insurance money. But having a theory and proving it in court are two very different things. They had no physical evidence linking Eric to the crime scene. No fingerprints, no DNA, no forensic evidence placing him in Bill's house that night. The 9mm Beretta that had likely been the murder weapon was never recovered. Without the gun, they couldn't prove Eric had fired it. They had no witnesses who saw Eric at the scene. The neighbor who'd seen the white Bronco couldn't make a positive identification of the driver. They had no confession. When detectives tried to interview Eric, he lawyered up immediately. He refused to answer questions about his relationship with Nanette or his whereabouts on December 15th. And they had no cooperation from Nanette. She maintained her innocence, denied any affair with Eric, and refused to implicate him in any way. The investigation stalled. Months passed with no arrests. The case grew cold. Bill's children hired private investigators, put pressure on the police department, demanded justice for their father. But without evidence, there was nothing the detectives could do. In early 1995, Eric Naposki moved to Connecticut. He was leaving California, leaving the area, leaving behind whatever connection he'd had to Nanette Johnston and Bill McLaughlin. Nanette collected on Bill's life insurance policies. Though the insurance companies fought her claim initially, she eventually received a substantial payout. She moved out of Bill's house. She started over. And for 15 years, she got away with murder. Throughout the late 1990s and into the 2000s, Bill McLaughlin's murder remained unsolved. The case file sat in the Newport Beach Police Department's Cold Case Division, a reminder of justice denied. Bill's children never gave up. They kept in contact with the detectives, provided any new information they discovered, and kept the pressure on the department to continue investigating. They knew Nanette had been involved. They knew she'd murdered their father for his money. But knowing something and proving it are different things. The lead detective on the case, Tom Voth, became obsessed with the murder. Even after he retired from the Newport Beach Police Department, he continued to think about the case, continued to review the evidence, looking for something he'd missed, some connection that would finally allow him to arrest Nanette and Eric. Meanwhile, Eric Naposki had moved on with his life. He'd relocated to Connecticut, where he worked in sales for a company that manufactured lighting products. He got engaged to a woman named Rosie, had a daughter, and settled into a quiet suburban life. If anyone from his new life asked about his past, he'd tell them about his football career with the Patriots and Colts. He never mentioned California. He never mentioned 1994. Nanette Johnston also moved on. She continued to work in financial services, though she moved around frequently, burning bridges, leaving employers under suspicious circumstances. There were always questions about missing money, about irregularities in accounts she managed, but nothing was ever proven. She maintained her innocence regarding Bill's murder. When people asked her about it, and sometimes people did because murder in Newport Beach's high society tends to be remembered, she'd play the victim. She'd talk about how traumatic it was to find Bill dying, how the police had suspected her unfairly, how she'd been persecuted because she was Bill's girlfriend. She was convincing. She'd had years of practice lying, years of practice manipulating people into seeing her the way she wanted to be seen. But detectives never stopped watching her. They kept tabs on her movements, her relationships, her finances. They were waiting for her to make a mistake. And in 2009, she finally did. In 2008, the Newport Beach Police Department reopened the McLaughlin murder investigation. Cold case technology had improved dramatically since 1994. DNA analysis was more sophisticated. Database searches were more comprehensive. Detective work that would have taken months in 1994 could now be done in days. The new lead detective, Larry Montgomery, began reviewing all the evidence with fresh eyes. He re-interviewed witnesses, some of whom were more willing to talk 15 years after the fact. He reviewed the phone records again, this time using modern data analysis techniques to map the communications between Nanette and Eric in the weeks leading up to the murder. And he discovered something interesting. In the weeks before Bill's death, the frequency of calls between Nanette and Eric had increased dramatically. They were talking multiple times per day, often for extended periods. Then, immediately after the murder, the calls stopped. Eric and Nanette never communicated again after December 15th, 1994. This pattern was significant. It suggested planning and coordination before the murder, followed by a deliberate cutoff of contact to avoid suspicion. Detective Montgomery also re-examined the financial records. He tracked every penny of the insurance payouts Nanette received after Bill's death. He documented her spending patterns, her debt before the murder, her sudden wealth after it. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Nanette's own mouth. By 2009, Nanette was working at a financial services company in California. She'd become friendly with a colleague, a man she trusted enough to confide in about her past. What Nanette didn't know was that this colleague had become suspicious of some financial irregularities involving Nanette and had contacted the police. With police cooperation, the colleague agreed to wear a wire during his conversations with Nanette. Over the course of several weeks, he engaged her in discussions about her past, about Bill McLaughlin, about what had really happened that night in December 1994. And Nanette, always confident in her ability to manipulate people, began to talk. She didn't confess outright. She was too smart for that. But she made statements that were deeply incriminating. She talked about how Bill had been taken care of. She made references to Eric, though never by name, calling him my friend who helped me with my problem. She discussed the life insurance money in ways that suggested she'd known it was coming, that she'd been counting on it. Most damning of all, when the colleague asked her directly, "Did you have Bill killed?" Nanette laughed and said, "Let's just say Bill got what he deserved, and I got what I deserved." It wasn't a confession, but combined with all the other evidence, the phone records, the financial motive, the missing gun, the white Bronco, it was enough. On June 15th, 2009, 15 years after Bill McLaughlin's murder, police arrested Nanette Johnston. She was charged with murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and special circumstances that made her eligible for life in prison without parole. The same day, detectives flew to Connecticut. They arrested Eric Naposki at his home, in front of his fiancée and daughter. Eric was stunned. He'd thought this was behind him, buried in the past, forgotten. He convinced himself that if they were going to arrest him, they would have done it years ago. He was wrong. The Orange County District Attorney's Office made a strategic decision. They would try Nanette Johnston and Eric Naposki separately. This would allow them to use each defendant's statements against the other without running into constitutional issues about the right to confront witnesses. Nanette's trial was scheduled first, beginning in early 2011. Eric's would follow later that year. For the prosecution, the strategy was clear. Pay Nanette as a master manipulator who'd use Eric Naposki as a weapon to kill Bill McLaughlin. Show the jury her financial motive, her pattern of deception, her calculated planning. Prove that she was the mastermind behind the murder. For Nanette's defense, the strategy was equally clear. Create reasonable doubt. Argue that there was no physical evidence linking Nanette to the murder. Suggest that Eric Naposki might have had his own motives for killing Bill. Point out that Nanette had an alibi. She was at a dinner party when Bill was killed. The stakes were enormous. If convicted, Nanette faced life in prison. At 54 years old, that would be a death sentence. Nanette's trial began on February 25th, 2011, in Santa Ana, California. The courtroom was packed with media, with Bill McLaughlin's children, with people who'd followed the case for years and were finally going to see justice served. The prosecution's case was circumstantial but powerful. They presented evidence of Nanette's financial troubles before Bill's death. She'd accumulated over $200,000 in debt and was facing bankruptcy. They showed how she'd forged Bill's signature on checks, embezzled money from his accounts, and fraudulently obtained life insurance policies. They established the affair with Eric Naposki through phone records, witness testimony from people who'd seen them together, and credit card receipts showing Nanette had paid for romantic dinners and hotel rooms for herself and Eric. They demonstrated opportunity. Nanette had access to Bill's guns, including the 9mm Beretta that was likely the murder weapon. She had a key to the house. She knew Bill's routines, knew when he'd be home alone, and they played the recorded conversations where Nanette had essentially admitted to having Bill killed. The defense fought back hard. Nanette's attorney, Gary Polson, argued that the prosecution's case was based entirely on inference and speculation. Yes, Nanette had financial problems, but that didn't make her a murderer. Yes, she'd had an affair, but adultery isn't murder. Yes, she benefited from Bill's death, but that didn't prove she caused it. Polson argued that Eric Naposki might have acted alone, that he might have had his own reasons for killing Bill. Perhaps he was trying to eliminate a rival for Nanette's affections, or perhaps he discovered Bill's wealth and decided to kill him in a robbery gone wrong. The defense also attacked the credibility of the recorded conversations. They argued that Nanette had been manipulated into making incriminating statements, that she was a woman prone to exaggeration and drama, and that her words had been taken out of context. But the prosecution had one more powerful piece of evidence: testimony from Bill McLaughlin's daughter, Kim. Kim took the stand and described how Nanette had changed after moving in with her father, how she'd become secretive and controlling, how she'd driven wedges between Bill and his children, how she spent money recklessly while claiming to love Bill. Most powerfully, Kim testified about a conversation she'd had with her father just 2 weeks before his death. Bill had told her he was planning to end his relationship with Nanette. He'd discovered financial irregularities and was going to confront her about them. He was planning to ask her to move out. This testimony was devastating for the defense. It established that Bill was about to leave Nanette, which would have cut off her access to his money and exposed her theft. It gave Nanette a compelling reason to act quickly, to kill Bill before he could end the relationship. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On March 17, 2011, they returned their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty of special circumstances, making her eligible for life without parole. Nanette showed no emotion as the verdict was read. She'd been preparing for this possibility for months. But inside, she must have known her life as a free woman was over. Sentencing was scheduled for a later date. First, it was Eric Naposki's turn to face justice. Eric's trial began on July 5, 2011. Unlike Nanette, who'd maintained her innocence throughout, Eric had a different strategy. He admitted to being at Bill McLaughlin's house on the night of the murder, but he claimed he'd been set up by Nanette. According to Eric's testimony, Nanette had told him Bill McLaughlin was her abusive business partner who was threatening her. She'd asked Eric to go to Bill's house to retrieve some important documents while Bill was out of town. She'd given him a key and specific instructions about where to find the papers. Eric claimed he'd gone to the house as requested, but when he arrived, Bill was there. Bill confronted him, asked him what he was doing in his house. The situation escalated. Eric claimed Bill reached for a gun, and Eric, trained to react quickly and violently from his football days, responded. The shooting, Eric claimed, was self-defense. He'd panicked afterward and fled the scene. It was a thin story, and the prosecution tore it apart methodically. First, they established that Bill hadn't been shot in a struggle. The wound patterns showed he'd been shot from behind, while reaching into the refrigerator. There was no evidence of a confrontation or fight. Second, they demonstrated through phone records and witness testimony that Eric had known exactly who Bill was. Multiple witnesses testified that Eric had mentioned Nanette's wealthy boyfriend in conversations. He knew Bill was rich. He knew Bill was Nanette's partner. The idea that he thought Bill was just a business associate was absurd. Third, they showed that Eric had been in deep financial trouble in 1994. He was behind on rent, had maxed out credit cards, and was facing eviction. Nanette had been giving him money, thousands of dollars in loans that were never repaid. The prosecution argued that Eric had killed Bill for money, either paid directly by Nanette or promised from the life insurance proceeds. The defense argued that Eric had been manipulated by Nanette, that he was essentially another one of her victims. They painted him as a man past his athletic prime, struggling financially, vulnerable to the manipulations of a sophisticated older woman. They argued that even if Eric had killed Bill, he'd done so believing he was protecting Nanette from an abusive partner. But the prosecution had Nanette's conviction to point to. They reminded the jury that Nanette had already been found guilty of orchestrating Bill's murder. Eric was her weapon, the gun she pointed at Bill McLaughlin and fired 6 times. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Eric himself took the stand. He was a sympathetic figure in some ways, a former athlete whose dreams had died, a man who'd been trying to rebuild his life when he met Nanette. He had a daughter now, a family, a life he'd built in Connecticut. He looked directly at the jury and said, "I didn't go there to kill anyone. I thought I was helping someone I cared about. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but I'm not a murderer." The prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal. "Mr. Naposki, you brought a gun to Bill McLaughlin's house that night, didn't you?" I don't remember." "You don't remember if you brought a gun? You shot a man 6 times, and you don't remember if you had a gun. It was a long time ago. Not so long that you've forgotten what you did. You knew Nanette Johnston stood to inherit millions if Bill died, didn't you?" "I didn't know about any insurance." "But you knew she was with a wealthy man. You knew Bill had money." "I knew he was successful, yes. And you knew that if Bill was out of the picture, Nanette would be free to be with you, and she'd have access to all that money?" "That's not why I went there." "Then why did you go there, Mr. Naposki? Why did you bring a gun? Why did you shoot an unarmed man 6 times while he was getting milk from his refrigerator?" Eric had no good answer, because there was no good answer. The jury deliberated for 4 days. On July 28, 2011, they returned their verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of special circumstances. Eric dropped his head when the verdict was read. Unlike Nanette, he showed emotion, grief, despair, the realization that his life was over. Both Nanette Johnston and Eric Naposki were sentenced in August 2011. Nanette received life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, in handing down the sentence, called her crime particularly heinous because of the degree of planning and manipulation involved. He noted that she'd shown no remorse, no acknowledgement of the pain she caused Bill's family, no recognition of the enormity of what she'd done. Nanette was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. At 55 years old, she would spend the rest of her life in the California Institution for Women in Corona, California. Eric Naposki received the same sentence, life without parole. The judge acknowledged that Eric had been manipulated by Nanette, but said that this didn't excuse his actions. He'd made a choice to bring a gun to Bill McLaughlin's house. He'd made a choice to pull the trigger 6 times. Those choices had consequences. Eric was sent to Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California, where he remains today. Before he was led away, Eric made a final statement to the court. He apologized to Bill McLaughlin's family. He said he thought about Bill every day, about the life he'd taken, about the pain he'd caused. He said he wished he could go back and make different choices, but he knew that was impossible. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said, his voice breaking. "I know I don't deserve it. I just want Bill's family to know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Bill's daughter Kim watched him from a gallery. She didn't acknowledge his apology. How could she? Sorry doesn't bring back the dead. Sorry doesn't erase the 16 years they'd waited for justice. Sorry doesn't heal the wound of losing a father to violence and greed. For Bill McLaughlin's children, Kim, Kevin, and Jenny, the convictions brought a measure of justice, but not peace. They'd lost their father in the most horrible way imaginable, murdered in his own home by people driven by nothing more than greed and selfishness. In victim impact statements read at sentencing, all 3 children spoke about the devastating effect their father's murder had on their lives. They talked about the years of uncertainty, the frustration of knowing who'd killed their father, but being unable to prove it, the relief when the arrest finally came. Kim, the eldest daughter, spoke about how she'd made it her mission to ensure Nanette and Eric faced justice. She'd hired private investigators, kept pressure on the police, refused to let the case be forgotten. She'd spent hundreds of thousands of dollars and countless hours pursuing her father's killers. "My father was a good man," she said at Nanette's sentencing. "He worked hard his entire life. He was generous, loving, and trusting. Nanette took advantage of that trust. She murdered him for money, and she tried to get away with it. I'm grateful to the police, the prosecutors, and everyone who helped bring her to justice. But I'll never forgive her for what she took from us." The civil aspect of the case was equally important to Bill's children. They filed wrongful death lawsuits against both Nanette and Eric, seeking to recover the insurance money Nanette had collected after Bill's death. After lengthy litigation, they won judgments against both defendants, though collecting on those judgments proved difficult since neither Nanette nor Eric had significant assets. More importantly, the children worked to ensure that their father's legacy wasn't defined by how he died. They established a scholarship fund in his name at the University of San Diego, where Bill had been a supporter of the business school. They shared stories about him with their own children, keeping his memory alive. "We won't let Nanette and Eric have the last word on who my father was," Kevin said in an interview after trials. "He was more than a murder victim. He was a father, a grandfather, a businessman, a friend. That's how we remember him." The McLaughlin case raised several interesting legal issues that continue to be studied by criminal justice professionals. First, there was a question of how two people could be successfully prosecuted for the same murder in separate trials. The prosecution had to be careful not to present contradictory theories. They couldn't argue that Nanette was a mastermind in her trial, and then argue that Eric acted alone in his trial. They maintained a consistent theory throughout. Nanette planned the murder and manipulated Eric into carrying it out, making both equally guilty. Second, there was the issue of prosecuting a murder 16 years after it occurred. Defense attorneys argued that the delay prejudiced their clients. Memories had faded, witnesses had died or moved away. Evidence had been lost. But the prosecution successfully argued that the delay was due to the defendant's own deception and that justice delayed is not justice denied. Third, the case highlighted the challenges of proving a murder-for-hire scheme when there is no direct evidence of payment or explicit agreement. The prosecution relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. Phone records, financial records, witness testimony about the relationship between Nanette and Eric. This kind of case requires jurors to make inferences and connect dots, which can be challenging. But the prosecution succeeded because the web of circumstantial evidence was so tight. Every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. The phone records showed planning. The financial records showed motive. The witness testimony showed opportunity. Together, it was overwhelming. Lessons from the case. The McLaughlin murder offers several important lessons for law enforcement, prosecutors, and the public. First, cold cases can be solved. The 16-year gap between the murder and the arrest might seem like a defeat for justice, but it also shows that persistent investigation, improved technology, and old-fashioned detective work can eventually crack even the most difficult cases. Detective Larry Montgomery's decision to re-examine the case with fresh eyes led directly to the breakthrough that resulted in arrests. Second, circumstantial evidence can be powerful. Many people think you need a confession, an eyewitness, or DNA evidence to convict someone of murder. But the McLaughlin case shows that a web of circumstantial evidence, phone records, financial documents, witness testimony, and behavior patterns can be just as convincing to a jury. Third, greed is a powerful motive. Nanette Johnston was willing to murder a man who loved her, who'd welcomed her into his home and his life, simply because she wanted his money. This kind of cold-blooded calculation is difficult for most people to comprehend, but it happens more often than we like to think. Fourth, manipulation can turn ordinary people into killers. Eric Naposki wasn't a career criminal. He was an athlete who'd fallen on hard times, vulnerable to manipulation by a woman who knew exactly which buttons to push. This doesn't excuse what he did. He made his own choices, and he's paying for them. But it does remind us that murder can happen when the wrong people meet at the wrong time under the wrong circumstances. Fifth, justice may be delayed, but it shouldn't be denied. Bill McLaughlin's children never gave up. They kept fighting for 16 years, kept pushing police to investigate, kept their father's case in the public eye. Their persistence was rewarded with convictions and life sentences for both defendants. As of 2026, both Nanette Johnston and Eric Naposki remain in California state prisons, serving life sentences without the possibility of parole. Nanette, now 70 years old, has reportedly become a model prisoner. She works in the prison library, has taken college courses, and participates in religious services. She has filed multiple appeals of her conviction, all of which have been denied. She maintains her innocence, claiming she was wrongly convicted based on circumstantial evidence and that Eric Naposki acted alone. Prison records show she receives occasional visits from family members, though her children have largely distanced themselves from her. She spends her days in a routine familiar to long-term prisoners: work details, meals in the cafeteria, limited recreation time. She will die in prison. Eric, now 58 years old, has taken a different path. He has acknowledged his role in Bill's death, though he continues to maintain that he was manipulated by Nanette and didn't understand the full scope of what he was doing. He has participated in programs for lifers, has become active in prison ministry, and has reportedly tried to counsel younger inmates against making the mistakes he made. His daughter, who was young when he was arrested, is now an adult. According to reports, she has maintained some contact with him, though the relationship is understandably strained. Eric has said in interviews that his greatest regret, beyond killing Bill McLaughlin, is the effect his actions had on his daughter. Like Nanette, Eric has filed appeals, all unsuccessful. He will also die in prison. Even with both defendants convicted and sentenced, questions remain about the McLaughlin murder. Did Eric Naposki know he was going to kill Bill McLaughlin when he drove to Balboa Cove that night? Or did he convince himself he was just going to talk to Bill to scare him, to protect Nanette? The jury found him guilty of premeditated murder, but Eric's internal state of mind that night remains known only to him. How much did Eric know about the insurance money? The prosecution argued he knew Nanette would inherit millions if Bill died, making him complicit in the entire scheme. Eric claimed he knew nothing about the insurance. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. He likely knew Bill was wealthy and that Nanette would benefit from his death, even if he didn't know the specific details. Was there explicit planning between Nanette and Eric? Or did Nanette manipulate him through suggestion and implication? This is perhaps the most intriguing question. Nanette was too smart to say, "Go kill Bill." But did she need to? Or did she create a situation where Eric felt killing Bill was his idea, his decision, his choice? Could this murder have been prevented? If Bill had listened to his children's concerns about Nanette earlier, if he'd discovered the embezzlement sooner, if he'd ended the relationship before Nanette felt trapped, would he still be alive? These are painful questions for Bill's family, questions without good answers. The McLaughlin case fits into a broader pattern of murders motivated by greed, particularly involving life insurance. Each year, hundreds of people are killed by spouses, partners, or family members who stand to benefit financially from their deaths. The case also highlights the vulnerability of wealthy older individuals who enter into new relationships late in life. Bill McLaughlin was a successful, intelligent businessman, but he was blinded by his feelings for Nanette. He ignored warning signs, dismissed concerns from his children, and gave Nanette access to his finances without adequate safeguards. Financial exploitation of the elderly is a growing problem in America, and it sometimes escalates to violence when the victim becomes suspicious or tries to cut off access to their money. Bill McLaughlin's murder was an extreme example, but the underlying dynamic, a younger person manipulating an older, wealthy individual for financial gain, is all too common. The conviction and sentencing of Nanette Johnston and Eric Naposki represent a victory for the criminal justice system, but it's a hollow victory in many ways. Bill McLaughlin is still dead. His grandchildren grew up without him. His children lost 16 years. They could have spent processing their grief instead of pursuing justice. The criminal justice system is designed to punish the guilty and deter future crimes, but it cannot undo harm. It cannot restore what was taken. It cannot give Bill back to his family. Still, there is something important about holding people accountable for their actions. Nanette and Eric took a life, and they're paying for that crime with their own lives, spent behind bars, cut off from freedom, from family, from everything that makes life worth living. Is that justice? Bill's children think so. They fought for 16 years to see Nanette and Eric convicted, and they expressed satisfaction when the verdicts were read. But justice is cold comfort when you're visiting your father's grave, when you're celebrating holidays without him, when you're reaching for the phone to share good news, and remembering he's not there to answer. On a cold December night in 1994, Eric Naposki made a choice that destroyed multiple lives. He chose to bring a gun to Bill McLaughlin's house. He chose to hide in the shadows and wait. He chose to pull the trigger 6 times, snuffing out a life for reasons that had nothing to do with Bill and everything to do with money and manipulation. Nanette Johnson made different choices, but equally destructive ones. She chose to lie, to steal, to manipulate. She chose to solve her financial problems with murder rather than honesty. She chose to use Eric as a weapon, then discard him when he was no longer useful. These choices rippled outward, creating waves of destruction that touched dozens of lives. Bill's children lost their father. Eric's daughter lost her father to prison. Friends and family members on all sides were forced to grapple with impossible questions about people they thought they knew. The story of Eric Naposki and the murder of Bill McLaughlin is ultimately a tragedy, not in the classical sense of noble characters brought down by fatal flaws, but in the modern sense of ordinary people making terrible decisions that lead to irreversible consequences. Bill McLaughlin deserved better. He deserved to grow old, to watch his grandchildren graduate from college, to enjoy the wealth he'd worked so hard to accumulate. Instead, he died on his kitchen floor, murdered by a man he'd never met on the orders of a woman he'd loved. Eric Naposki deserved consequences for his actions, and he received them. But there's something tragic about a man who threw away his life, who went from NFL linebacker to convicted murderer, because he fell under the spell of a woman who saw him as nothing more than a tool. And Nanette Johnston? She deserves no sympathy. She orchestrated a murder for money, showed no remorse, and would likely do it again if given the opportunity. She'll spend the rest of her life in prison, and that's exactly where she belongs. In the end, this is a story about choices and consequences, about greed and manipulation, about a justice system that sometimes moves slowly but can still arrive at the truth, about families torn apart by violence and trying to piece their lives back together afterward. It's a story that should have never happened, but it did, and now it serves as a reminder that evil doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it looks like a charming woman with a beautiful smile. Sometimes it looks like a professional athlete trying to help someone he cares about. And sometimes justice takes 16 years to arrive. But when it does, it's absolute. Bill McLaughlin's murder will never be forgotten. Not by his family, not by the detectives who worked tirelessly to solve it, not by the community that was shocked by the violence in their midst. His story, and the story of the two people who killed him, will be told and retold, a cautionary tale about the darkest aspect of human nature. On December 15th, 1994, 6 gunshots shattered the silence of an affluent Orange County neighborhood. Those shots echoed through the legal system for 16 years before finally finding their mark. 2 life sentences, without the possibility of parole. Justice delayed, perhaps, but justice nonetheless. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to True Crime Zone. These cases deserve to be remembered. The victims deserve to have their stories told. And the lessons learned from these tragedies can help prevent future violence. Justice may be slow, but it should never be silent. Thank you for listening. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who seem the most ordinary.